We're in the middle of an annual open house at the Camp Casey Conference Center, not to be confused with the Fort Casey State Park, which is just on the other side of the tree line. And the university, Seattle Pacific University from Seattle, where I've taught for 40 years, has this as its island campus. People like the wonderful folks that are up here all the time, like Robin Myers here, my good friend, consider the Seattle campus the southern extension of the main campus here on Whidbey Island. But we in Seattle have a slightly different perspective. But I love this place. I've been coming up here. I've been involved for these 4 decades that I've taught history at Seattle Pacific University. My name is Bill Woodward, and I am still pleased to have the partnership with Seattle Pacific. I love SPU, and have a lot of fun coming up here, doing both the enjoying the area and the historical thing. So what we're going to do is give you kind of a global picture of what and why and when is this thing here, and why is it such a wonderful state park. Then, how many of you have already toured the Colonel's house, which was up, okay, so you know that Steve Kalk, a brilliant expert on all things coast defense, and on the life of the soldier and the officers in the fort back in the day, leads that, and so I commend that to you. An alternative for 3:15 after this program is I'm going to lead a walking tour of the gun batteries. And so there'll be a little overlap, but not a whole lot. I'm going to give you the global picture. Steve gives you the micro picture of what it was like to live and serve at these forts. And then we'll kind of get the business end and talk a little bit about the technology and the strategy and the targets you couldn't see if the weather was like this and you were trying to figure out how to repel an invader. So we've got kind of all 3 levels, and thank you for being here.
I have a question. I'm not clear. I'm assuming you're going to talk about, include how it's used to date by the school?
That's how the tour begins, yes. As a matter of fact, this is kind of why the fort today's talk. Or if you're not going to take the tour, then I'll just chat with you right afterwards, okay? Because they'd love for you to know. That's the whole point of the open house, is to let you know what we do here. And since you asked, let me say very briefly, conference center, groups, nonprofit groups, hold retreats, do science education. The schools come in here all spring. If you haven't had a chance, stop in and see Keith at the C Lab at the end of the building structure on the other side of the parade ground. Keith is a longtime enemy. He and I have just this great relationship going back where we disrespect each other very cordially every time we see each other. Are you still here? What are you doing here, old man? And but he's great, and he knows his stuff. He's a naturalist, and he heads up the science education program for upper elementary kids. Conferences, retreats, full meal service catered, and all the other things. And there are ways in which Seattle Pacific University, through Camp Casey Conference Center, is just really thrilled to be part of the Whidbey Island community, to be part of Evie's Landing Historical Reserve, a National Park Service organized and administered but locally run historic district, and with a connection to the actual academic campus and opportunity for academic groups to be up here too. So we've got a group here from Canada today or this week. Robin, tonight.
First week, Dudley College is here today. Yeah, we'll have lots of people.
So people cycle through the school year and through the summer. So that's the short answer, and we'll talk about how it happened to come into Seattle Pacific's hands.
You mentioned 2 different groups. Who's responsible for the upkeep?
The Camp Casey Conference Center campus is a standalone budgetary entity, a cost center. So the university owns it. Yeah, the Seattle Pacific University owns it. But it has to run its own show. And they do a great job. And that's been the case. Okay, I'll give it away. One other thing I will say on the tour is this has been Seattle Pacific's campus longer than it belonged to the federal government. So, see me later, and I'll join the tour, and I'll tell a little bit more of that story. But what I'd like you to do in this, as we begin this talk, is go on a little journey with me in your imagination. Let's go back more than 200 years to the year that was the 300th anniversary of the first European arrival in North America, the shores of North America, that mattered. Okay, the Vikings got here and left. They only got as far as Minnesota and founded the football team, but didn't. To tell students when they don't take notes on things that are not true that I tell them, and they think they're going to be quizzed on my jokes. They're wonderful jokes, but I don't quiz them with anything. They're terrible. And Columbus's discovery was recognized and marked in 1792 on its 300th anniversary. But what I'd like you to imagine is someone from a lower Skagit village who goes out and looks at this lovely fog, often a beautiful vista. How many of you are from Whidbey Island, by the way? So you know what we're talking about. You know what the good days and the marine days look like. And sort of exults. This is our land. This is our place. But we have a problem. A problem of homeland defense. Yes, this is the place we live. But there are enemies, invaders, who come down from the north, from what later will be called British Columbia and Alaska. The enemy Haida people who come down in their great war canoes and invade our gentle, peaceful villages and take away our people to be their slaves. We have a problem of homeland defense. But what's this that I see? It's not a war canoe. Is it a bird canoe? A canoe with white wings above it? I've never seen this before. No, that's the ship of Captain George Vancouver of the British Royal Navy. And Captain Vancouver is the first European to enter the waters that will become named for one of his lieutenants, Puget Sound. And Captain Vancouver is alert to the possibilities that this coast, after exploration of the eastern coasts of the continents, this coast, previously unexplored by Europeans, has possibilities too. This, he says, could be our place. But there's a problem. If we claim this, there's a problem of homeland defense. But I see a solution. Many days you can see it from here. This is a vista from Casey. And underneath the Olympic Mountains, just to the north of the Point Hudson, or Port Townsend is, where the ferry goes, there's this mesa-like island standing up out of the Strait of Juan. And George Vancouver named it Protection Island, because he saw that would be a place to build a fort to defend British interests against British rivals. Now, in a delicious irony, although no fort, really no human village, there were a couple of temporary homesteaders, I think, way back in the day. No fort, nothing was built on that island. And today, it's a bird refuge. It is indeed a protection island. As George Vancouver sailed into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, he noticed something odd way out at the entry to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Among the villages of the Makah people, whale hunters who live right out on the coast. A strangely European-looking structure being built. And if we went there and approached someone who clearly was not Makah and said, Senor Fidalgo, what are you doing here? And in Spanish, he would reply, this is our land. 300 years ago, Cristoforo Colombo came and sailed and found the New World and claimed it for Spain. This is our land. But we have a problem of homeland defense. The British, the Russians, the Americans, they're showing up in these waters that are ours. We need to demonstrate that we have a presence here. So they won't say we haven't settled these lands we claim. We project a little farther out into the Pacific and south. Oh, I get what Senor Fidalgo meant. That's an American flag flying on that trading ship. A ship commanded by Captain Robert Gray, who, unlike previous European explorers, discoverers, found a river and sailed into it and named it for his ship, the Columbia. Columbia's River. Everybody was naming everything for Columbus on the 300th anniversary. There's Columbia, South Carolina. And there's Columbus, Ohio. And General Washington has been asked to find a place for a new federal city, and we're going to call it the District of Columbia. All things Columbus or Columbia in 1792, including Gray's ship, for which he named the river that bears the name to this day. This, said Gray, as he claimed the Columbia River for the United States, shall be our land. But we have a problem of homeland defense. We don't have anybody out here to protect our interest. And in that, Captain Gray was echoing the concerns, the real deep fears of a gentleman back in the capital of the very young United States of America, who had been present at the creation of the nation in 1776, when, having become a new nation, the nation decided it needed a seal. Does this look familiar? Anybody looked at the back of a $1 bill lately?
Yeah.
The Great Seal of the United States carries a logo and a motto. Annuit Keptis means he has favored, God has favored, or Providence has favored our undertaking. And like Robert Gray, the merchant, the new president of the new nation, President George Washington, who ironically will give his name to these these shores that we're talking about, believed that the creation of this new republic, of which he was now the custodian, was the result of providential care. And so that which Providence had provided needed to be protected. But George Washington and his advisors back in the capital of Philadelphia recognized that there was a problem. There was a problem of homeland defense. This was a new and infant and vulnerable and very divided republic of 13 states, or were they independent nations, who had disbanded what army and navy they had just at the time when the global situation was becoming highly dangerous. Once again, in 1792, the two ancient enemies, the superpowers of the world, Britain and France, had again gone to war with each other. The British, powerful on the high seas, faced off against the French, powerful in their land armies, especially as commanded by General Napoleon. And the U.S., the infant, defenseless U.S., was caught in the middle. The former colonies of Britain and fighting bitterly against the empire to win their independence, thanks to their alliance with the French, which was very uncomfortable. And we certainly don't want to become a puppet of this Frenchman Napoleon. What is an infant republic to do? To the concern that we have, how America did homeland defense the old-fashioned way. And you were standing on the ground. That is a partial answer to that story, or to that question. And so, to the story of how Americans did homeland defense long before Camp Casey was ever built, courtesy of decisions made in the Washington administration. So we have 4 claimants to this domain that will one day bear the name of President Washington. The natives, the British, the Spanish, the Americans. We could add the Russians, who were kind of interested in moving southward from Alaska. And these leaders all had this sense that if this is going to be ours, we're going to have to figure out a way to protect it, to defend it. From these vignettes of 1792 came 2 landmark developments that I want to tell you about. The first is an enduring national security strategy, a strategy for homeland defense, we would now call it. A strategy that would protect an insular, an island republic that was very vulnerable in a dangerous world. And I want to explain that strategy, which became dominant in the 1800s after the Washington administration kind of put it in place, and remained dominant into the 20th century, and in some ways still shapes the way we do foreign policy and security strategy to this day. And then, more particularly, I want to show how that strategy underwrote the emplacement of defensive works at the entryways of Puget Sound and Columbia's River. Now silent forts that make us wander and wonder. When did this get built? Why? What was this for? So, I want to explain those mysterious seacoast forts as products of how we did homeland defense the old-fashioned way. So, let's begin with this idea of America's basic national security strategy, what it was, and also the values that underlay it. Most of you in this room, if not all, unlike my college students I teach now, remember 9/11, September 11th, 2001. The United States of America blindsided by a surprise attack on its own soil, only the 3rd time in our history that our own territory has been attacked deliberately. 4th, if you're a technical historian who wants to quibble with my count. 4th is Pancho Villa. I won't tell that story. And each time Americans said, never again. We're going to make ourselves invulnerable. So I think with that reminder, you perhaps can go back with me to an earlier time, because before there was 9/11, there was 8/14, August 1814. That was the first time that the United States was attacked on its own soil after it became independent. A British fleet sailed into Chesapeake Bay, burned Washington, D.C., and then sailed northward to attack the town of Baltimore. Defending the town of Baltimore was a fort with some guns, an earthworks fort that sustained the bombardment from the British fleet, did not capitulate, and the British fleet had to be turned away. You know that story. You sing about it. Oh say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? You probably haven't recently sung other verses of that poem that was written by Francis Scott Key, standing on the deck of one of those British ships as a detainee. On the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. What is that which this breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the StarSpangled Banner. Oh, long may she wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Go look up verses 3 and 4. Everyone should read them at least once in their lifetimes. He articulated, and eventually we incorporated as our national anthem, this celebration of a coast fortification fending off the attack by an invading foreign power. That is to say, before the destruction of the World Trade Towers on September 11, 2001, there was the destruction of the U.S. Capitol in August of 1814. And before the shock and anger Americans have felt since 2001, and their determination to make sure it never happens again, there was the same kind of shock and anger and determination felt after August of 1814. And as there was somewhat of a sense of vindication at some points, perhaps most fully when Osama bin Laden was taken out, so Americans celebrated the fact that Fort McHenry had prevented the defeat of the city of Baltimore. And before Americans honored the memories of people like Todd Beamer, they sang the ballad penned by Francis Scott Key. Before the 21st century, American leadership created the Department of Homeland Security in response to September 11th, 2001. American leaders devised strategies to prevent another attack from abroad. And that was a system, actually 3 generations of systems of coast forts, of which Casey is the 3rd. But before we talk about Fort Casey, I want to make sure we understand that America's approach to national security strategy rested on a conscious articulation of American values. From its origins, in the rhetoric that even led up to the American Revolution, Americans imagined themselves as a special place, with special identifiers, possessors of special values. In fact, Americans have always seen ourselves, I think, certainly in our earliest years, not just as a place, but an idea. And to defend the idea, you have to defend the place. So Americans, somewhat paradoxically, have always felt uniquely aloof and separate and different from the rest of the world, but uniquely vulnerable and accessible to the rest of the world. So leaders have tried to keep the United States and its distinctive way of life safe behind what you might say is a two-ocean moat that protects the island at least somewhat. While at the same time projecting beyond our borders, because the lifeline, the economic lifeline of the country, is going to be its trade with other nations. Well, I think in today's global arena, these same instincts rule. And that explains how seacoast forts became the nation's primary defense strategy. And as I said, it began in the Washington administration, and it rested on fundamental beliefs, two in particular that related to national strategy. The first was, we are separate from Europe. We are not like Europe. We will not connect ourselves with either Britain or France. It was Washington himself who said we should have no permanent alliances. We should be friends of all and special partners or friends of none. And how to do that if you don't have a strong tradition of military might like some of those European nations? Well, we don't know, because our values say standing armies, a permanent military establishment, is a fundamental threat to liberty. That was one of the arguments bringing about the American Revolution. They were redcoats stationed and they were instruments of tyranny. We're independent. Who's there to protect us? We don't believe in standing armies. So came the Twofold Strategy that the Washington administration created. The Adams and Jefferson administrations that followed began to implement, that were verified, confirmed, and anchored and extended because of the experience of the War of 1812 and the defense of Fort McHenry and Baltimore, and then became the basic approach to national security. The first of these is to use a very tiny and specialized army, primarily of engineering types, to build forts that will defend key points that an invading nation might attack, like our coast towns. The second is to come up with an even more minimal handful of naval vessels that can go out and kind of protect merchant ships and show the flag and convince other nations that we're out there and they better not mess with us. The Army has a role, but it's going to be very small. The Navy has a role, and it's going to be very small. And that was the strategy that was established and confirmed after the War of 1812, after the British invasion failed. But then, huge changes to America. The 13 original states export their people into the interior and eventually all the way out to another coast, creating another homeland defense problem. We don't just defend the harbors on the Atlantic coast, we've got another coast. The famed Overland Trail experience leads people out to the Pacific Northwest. Along about the 1850s, this is when the Oregon Trail experience is at its height, when settlers are beginning to fill up the Willamette Valley and even filtering into Puget Sound, and right on the eve of the Civil War. So this is a very controversial and contested time in American history. The settlers out here are pleading with Washington, D.C. to do on the Pacific coast what they have already done on the Atlantic coast. Give us help, give us protection. And there actually are maybe up to half a dozen survey teams mostly from the Army Corps of Engineers that come out here and assess the situation. What is the danger and what could be done to address it? And I want to quote a couple of these surveys because I think they're kind of interesting. The first question, of course, is, well, who's the threat? And guess who these American military officers identified as the most dangerous threat to the settlers on Puget Sound? It was those Indian tribes from the north in their war canoes. Listen to this. This is a report from 1855. The northern tribes appear to be of a superior race in intelligence and courage. They are numerous, brave, and warlike. Their skill and workmanship is shown to advantage in their canoes. These canoes are the finest boats in the world and are of all sizes, from the small river canoe to the great war boat of 60 to 100 feet in length, hollowed from a single tree from the giant forests of the north. And they fear nothing except one thing, and so this was the recommendation of the report. A small and swift steamer, well provided with boats and boat howitzers, would achieve protection for the whole sound, because the Indians, while they laugh at sails, have a wholesome fear of a steamboat. You get a little bit more modern technology and maybe you can protect yourself. You see what's going on? And it's not the last time. Other reports kind of worried about foreign navies, particularly the British Navy, which had a new naval base in Victoria at Esquimalt Harbor, which was just sort of staring down our throats. But nothing really was done. There was one report that pleaded, once the British built that installation in the late 1850s, that Puget Sound be protected, but the mouth of the Columbia River, where more settlers were, the mouth of Puget Sound remained vulnerable. One individual just sort of shrugged, and this is on the eve of the Civil War. One general said, "Everything has yet to be done." And then came the Civil War, 1860s, and a startling turn of events. And in my research I'm a historian, I know about the Civil War, I know what's going on, and was surprised when I dug deeper and discovered, first of all, was reminded, I knew this, that the Civil War began with an attack on a coast fort. Fort Sumter, in the harbor of South Carolina's Charleston City, which had been built to protect Charleston against invading navies, and instead the Confederate forces fired at it from behind and reduced it to rubble, and it surrendered, and that was the beginning of the war. Okay, so that gets us to the war, the Civil War, and the North fighting the South. But you'd think that with all he had to do, Lincoln wouldn't pay much attention to those few folks out on Puget Sound, but not true. The Lincoln administration was deeply concerned with the security of those few settlements out on the Pacific coast. California and Oregon by now were states. Washington was a territory. There were quite a few people by now. And the Lincoln administration deeply feared, one, Confederate warships that might attack without any defenses Americans on the Pacific coast, new colonies in the New World. And I don't know how many of you know this, but the French actually did it in Mexico. Moved in and took over the government of Mexico for 3 or 4 or 5 years while the Americans were preoccupied with the Civil War. And here sit the British in Victoria, and all sorts of things worried the Lincoln administration. And so finally, toward the end of the Civil War, there was enough output from American armories and weapons works that some guns could be spared, could be forged and shipped out, and the first were installed at the mouth of the Columbia River. So Fort Sumter reminded us that coast fortifications were essential to defense. And guess what? The mouth of the Columbia lends itself to placing guns to prevent an invasion into the river and up to Portland and other settlement areas. And so at both Cape Disappointment on what's now the Washington side and Point Adams on the Oregon side, first in what's now Fort Stevens, and then on the other side of the river on the Washington side, primitive, almost surplus weapons, guns, were installed as sort of a temporary stopgap measure. What's interesting is that push during the Civil War kind of petered out after the Civil War. Americans were kind of exhausted with all of the business of warfare. The Army basically shrank to a skeleton force, nothing more than pretty much a police force against the tribes of the West. The Navy shrunk to almost nothing. And meanwhile, other nations, European nations, are beginning to build up modern armed forces, and especially modern naval forces, making the coasts even more vulnerable. So we come to the story of the forts that are eventually built on the mouth of the Columbia and the mouth of Puget Sound. This is the third system of coast fortifications. Do you remember what Fort McHenry looked like? Earthworks in star formation, which would make it easier if there was a landing party that attacked the fort, would provide ways to move artillery and infantry quickly from one to the other. It's a French model that the Americans picked up on. Okay, that looks very different from Fort Sumter, right? Which is this huge masonry structure on an artificial island. How many of you have been to the Bay Area, or from the Bay Area, and can picture at the south end of the Golden Gate Bridge, under the Golden Gate Bridge, there's a fort. Anybody ever been there? To Fort Point? Okay, you can picture that. It looks rather like, maybe even taller, than Fort Sumter. That is to say, it is masonry, it's exposed, it's designed to tell invading sailing warships, don't you dare try, look what we've got in our holster. But if we move to the new navies that are steam and steel, and would like to know where you are so they can reduce you to rubble, Endicott, who was a colonel, I guess, for the Corps of Engineers and worked with a board to invent a third system, said, here's what the invading Navy should see. That's what you see from the ferry from Port Townsend? Do you see Fort Casey? No. So beginning about 1900, extensive concrete installations, works, are built into the backside of the bluffs, so that you can't see them. A disappearing gun is mounted. You can see one. We'll talk about it on the tour. I think I said this at the beginning at 3:15, and I'll tell you where when we're done. If not, remind me. These guns were designed to fire and then retract, so you couldn't see them. They would be, here's the, one of them being brought in and installed, and here's what happens when they load it from the... We can talk about this afterwards. But one thing that strikes me is the notion that actually didn't die when guns aimed at invading warships from behind bluffs that you couldn't see them. When that became obsolete, when we needed a fourth system of defense. But the idea that what America should do to promote its security is to deter anyone who wants to get us, right? Whether you make the big masonry structure that intimidates the sailing ship, the man of war, or you hide your artillery but you let them know it's there so that you can gauge if they can. But that's been the principle. And you never know if it's successful. Because if it works, nothing ever happens. That's the story of the Cold War, essentially. We never had to use the nukes. And we're glad. But it's kind of a dicey policy or strategy to use. Because what if they call our bluff? And of course, that's the story of 9/11. We're going to slap you in the face, show you that you're not invulnerable. Well, yes, we are. we're gonna get you. Whatever you think about the politics, the strategy, the prosecution of the response to 9/11, what I'm saying is, generally speaking, American attitudes and American leaders' attitudes about national security are sustained with that idea that we try to deter anything from happening. Another thing that I think is a cool legacy, look at all the great state parks we have because these places went obsolete. I'll take it. Or in this case, the university campus. I have been struck with how much you can tell, and I hope this has come clear today, how much you can tell about a big story, a national story, a global story, by realizing what you're seeing in microcosm on the ground in a single place. And conversely, how the big stories play themselves out in localities, that interdependence of the big history and what is the particular history of a particular place. And I think you see that with these coast forts. This is something that I'll highlight on the tour, but I want to do so now. When those forts, there's one on the other side of the Sound, there's two on the other side of the Sound, there's three at the mouth of the Columbia, when they were built around 1900, somewhat belatedly, the Army kind of knocked itself on the head and said, you know, we've built these forts, we've deployed these guns, and we don't have enough soldiers to run the forts. What are we going to do? And so they invented something called the Coastal Artillery Reserve Corps. Because it's right about this time that the individual states and their militia forces are transformed into a federal reserve corps force called the National Guard. And I served in the National Guard for 25 years, so if you've got another hour, I can preach my sermon on the value of a trained reserve force. And there were units in the National Guard of the coastal states that did nothing except go to the forts and train with the regulars so that when and if they were needed, they would go and be able to do a shift around the clock to protect the Sound and the river. And out of that came, and again, this is a story I'm going to tell on the tour, the digital computer. It's tied to the need for accurate information about artillery pieces. It happened during World War II, long after the forts had been shuttered, but the process that began with coast artillery and the need for particular kinds of data in order to ensure the accuracy of fires that are coordinated from various guns on a moving target, you with me? All that complicated system required more than just mechanical solutions. It required the deployment of this new technology of electronics. More on that story. And lastly for now, just a reminder that ideas about Homeland Security, both strategy and the values underlying them, I think have sustained through generations of technology. Let me close with a story. Before 9/11, 2001, there was 8/14, August 1814. After 8/14, there was 8/14, August 1914. Does anyone happen to know why that month is significant? Anybody ever heard the title or read the book by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August? As one diplomat said that month, all of a sudden the lights went out all over Europe. That's when the First World War began, and everything changed. The First World War had a bunch of new technologies, including one in particular that made those guns completely obsolete in an instant. What am I talking about?
Airplanes.
It's now a three-dimensional battlefield, and those guns are not engaging airplanes. Although we're used to aiming at moving targets, and in fact, the technologies, as they improved to anti-aircraft artillery, used some of the same processes and training that the coast artillerists followed. And that fall, somewhat coincidentally, but very revealingly, there was something that went on. I'm paraphrasing the report. The U.S. Navy has lost strategic control of the Pacific Ocean, and an invading fleet is headed for the West Coast to attack one of our port cities. And the only thing that stands between that attack and the destruction of our homeland towns and people are the coast artillery installations. That fleet has 17 ships. We know the names. Names like Mikasi. Will they try and run the guns and invade right into the heart of the countryside? Will they try to get a landing party that will come up to the rear of the guns and reduce the fort by land? How can we protect our homeland? That was the scenario for a training exercise at the coast forts in the fall of 1914, and with incredible forethought, the threat identified was Japanese. It would take from 1914 to 1941 before that happened in fact. But already strategic thinkers were imagining what Americans might have to defend against. As it happened, the Japanese were underestimated. They were able to achieve the extraordinary surprise attack on American soil, the middle of the 3 times when the United States has suffered a surprise attack of sorts on our own soil. And each time we said, never again. There's a problem of homeland security, and we better fix it. And so what you see is kind of the middle of that story. And if you'll come with me, I'll show, pointed out on the ground, that there was in time, there was a technology, there was a place where Americans made the determination that they could protect themselves. And this was one chapter in that moving story. Before there was 9/11, there was 8/14. After there was 8/14, there was 8/14, 1914. And that 1914 was the hinge point, when the United States no longer thought it could simply sit here as an island in our part of the world and defend ourselves or deter foreign attacks. But we would have to become proactive and project American power to distant shores to meet the potential threat there, lest they come here. Does that ring true now? You see, why are there forward deployed troops during the Cold War? Aren't the missiles we have here enough? No. Everything changed with the First World War, and America's relationship with the world in terms of international security being essential to homeland security. Precisely at the moment when Washington's seacoast forts like Fort Casey lapsed into obsolescence, America's quest for security took on global dimensions. December 1941, September 2001, again jolted the American psyche, and we sent soldiers beyond our shores, many of whom came from this state, many of whose forebears sat here at Fort Casey and never fired a gun in anger. but we're ready to, if they needed to. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to
Thank you.
Camp KC.